All right, so now we are on to economics. This is our first lecture in the economics series, and it's fairly short, although there is a lot packed into it. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of stuff that you just have to know just as essentials. You can't hope to possibly answer any of these questions correctly or get close to understand the analytical point of view of economics in general if you can't get this basic stuff down. So make sure you take very good notes on it, ask lots of questions any way you want to. You can comment, send an email, however you want to. Ask the questions so I know where you are in this class, and because if you can't get ahead here or get on pace here, you're going to be very much behind. All right, so the reason why this lecture is called The Fundamental Economic Problem is because that is what economics is. Economics is literally the problem itself. So economics is the study of how we make decisions in a world where resources are limited, and the key problem is the last half of that sentence, where resources are limited. Another way to say this is we have unlimited wants and needs and limited resources to acquire them. So we have to make choices. Sometimes the choices are easy, sometimes they are hard. That last concept of limited resources is scarcity. This is the fundamental economic problem. We have unlimited wants, but a limited amount of resources, just like I said earlier. Because of scarcity, we have to make big decisions and sometimes small decisions about our needs versus our wants. So the things that we need, food, clothing, shelter, certain other things depending on where you live and what you do, versus our wants. Things we just desire, things that make us happy, things that make life more comfortable. And by doing this, we have to make economic choices. And by we, I mean the personal we, so like individual personal finance choices. It also means we as in societies and people, countries, companies. It's like the universal we. So the three fundamental economic questions we or a company or a country has to answer. First, a society must decide what to produce with its limited resources. So we only have so much iron. What are we going to do with the iron? We're going to make steel. We're going to make guns. We're going to make steel girders for buildings. We're going to make a sword in the year 2017. Are we going to make 1,000 guns or 1,000 swords? We're probably going to make the guns. It's all about choice, what we do with that raw material of iron. We must then decide how we're going to do it. What methods do we use? Do we use mechanization with pouring the steel that's been boiled, that's been melted down? Do we use labor in another country? Do we use labor in this country? Do we decide to do it in a way that's safe and supportive of the workers, or do we do it in a way that's almost like slavery and dangerous and terrible working conditions? That's the choice of how to produce something. And finally, we've got to decide who are we producing for. Are we going to produce for American workers who need to have steel to go to work and build their building? Are we going to make steel fork utensils so people in America have what they need to eat with, like utensil-wise? Are we going to make steel for North Korea? Even though we're America? Probably not. Well, we're making a choice there. We're choosing who we're going to take our products to and sell. Take a look at this. How does it get made? It's made by hand. This is an old-fashioned lumen fabric. There's another way to make this. Mass production at a high level where you can make the same daggone thing. It won't have that homemade touch, but it's just how we're choosing to make it. Do we want to make things in a way that is more sustainable, hand by hand, where it supports this person who makes it? Or do we make it in a mass-produced fashion where this person is not supported, doesn't make any money? It's all about another way to ask this is what is being made here, but also who's affected by making it. The how is also how it impacts everybody else. So this lady working on a loom, think of the alternative being like a fast looming system at a big textile mill. More economic choices. All right, depending on when you're watching this, I recorded this in 2017. The world food supply, and we've lived so long with what we call ethanol gas. Well, ethanol comes from corn. Corn is basically processed down, and they ferment it and get the alcohol out of it, and they put it into fuel so it will burn cleaner. Well, we've chosen to use that massive amount of corn for our gasoline to make the cars run cleaner. Not necessarily better, because technically ethanol-free gas works better in American engines, but it's better for the environment. So we're choosing to use that for alternative fuels instead of helping this little starving girl from Haiti. This cartoon would have come out right around the time of the Haitian earthquakes, where basically they're still recovering from it. So we're making a choice here. As a society, as America, we're saying, well, we value the idea of putting our corn, for lack of a better word, into the gas as alcohol more than we value taking that same corn and putting it into the bellies of people who are starving or hurting. We can't. If you got 100 tons of corn, you can't spend the 100 tons twice. You got to either put part of it in the belly of a Haitian girl or part of it in the belly of this tanker truck. And once you've used it for one thing, it can't be used for the other. All right, next thing is talking about using economic models. An economic model is an overly simplified representation of real-world economic theories. So it's very rare that you're going to see an economic model that is as complex as the actual situation. But the idea behind an economic model is no matter what you do to it, the rules still stay the same. It might get more complex as you add more real-world stimulus or real-world factors, but the rules still stay the same, like supply and demand. When supply goes up, price goes down. When demand goes up, price goes up. When demand goes down, price goes down. No matter how many other little factors you throw in there, all they really do is have an effect on that outcome, but they don't actually change the laws that are described by the economic model. Now, the reason why these exist is because economists use them to help better understand past, present, and future economic trends. So it's used as a tool in the economics tool belt. They're basically trying to figure out what could happen soon based on past representations in these models. Now, often it happens the predictions turn out to be wrong. That doesn't mean you throw the whole model out. It doesn't mean that the supply and demand model, as an example, if supply goes down and price didn't go up, we don't use that as a reason to throw out the traditional supply and demand model, because that would be opposite of what typically happens. We then revise the model, try to find a reason or an explanation as to why this happened differently this time, what other stimulus or other factors were involved that made this economic model not feasible this time, and then we adjust the model so it's more accurate later. Businesses, governments, small cities, all kinds of people, individuals in their household will use economic models. The idea of a budget, in theory, is just an economic model. The basics of it is you want your income to be greater than your expenses. Boom. That's the economic model. That is a perfect budget because it means you're saving or have excess or surplus money each month. That's a basic economic model. Now, it's way more complex than that in real life, but all it does is add complexity. It doesn't change the actual function. You still want your expenses to be less than your income. That way you make money. The same thing for business level economic models. It works the exact same way. It's just more complex it becomes. All it does is change the complexity. It doesn't actually change the outcomes typically. And if it does change the outcomes, we just revise the model to be more representative of what actually happens. All right, making economic choices or decisions. Trade-offs. All right, trade-offs and opportunity costs are going to be talked about in just a minute. Don't get them confused. They are different. All right. A trade-off is an economic decision-making that requires that we take into account the costs and all the benefits of the action. A trade-off is the alternative you face if you choose to do the one thing rather than the other. So I can do X or I can do Y. And the example here is choosing to spend an hour playing video games means having less time to spend on homework. Businesses, people, we make these trade-offs all the time. We just don't even realize we've done it. Am I going to study or am I going to watch Real Housewives of Atlanta? I don't have that hour in time exists once, and that's it. Then you're done. Now you can DVR it, but you still got to spend that hour later on that you could spend on doing something else more productive. This is a way to model out how we use resources. I can spend this 100 tons of iron on making swords, or I can choose to use it on making gun parts. Which one's more productive if my goal is military force? Depends on the circumstances, the situations around it. That complexity can add to it, but it's still a trade-off. You can still only spend that iron on one or the other. Every ounce of iron you use for the sword is iron that you then can't use on the gun parts. All right, this is where it gets a little confusing. Opportunity costs are a little bit different. It's the value of what you had to give up in the choice you made. It's more than just money. It includes things like discomfort, inconveniences linked to the choice being made. Like the opportunity cost of playing video games is the time you could have spent doing your homework. So it's what you're giving up. So trade-offs will have an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost isn't necessarily a trade-off. So a trade-off obviously is the video game versus homework example. if you choose either one of those, the opportunity is everything you lose by not doing by choosing one action over the other. And technically, in this example, is not broad enough. So if I choose to play video games for an hour, that means for that hour, I am only playing video games. That means everything else in the world, every opportunity to read a book, to learn a language, to do a billion other things is gone. I cannot do it for that hour because I've made the choice to spend it playing video games. The opportunity cost is everything else I could have been doing instead. That's how that works. All right, let's talk about costs and revenues. This, if you were looking at this in a personal finance sense, we would call this income versus expenses. So expenses would be your costs, revenue would be your income. Businesses make economic choices based on cost and benefits. Now, typically in a business sense, revenue is the benefit, but there are other kind of benefits out there. So a business might donate money to help victims of a flood. Well, when you donate money, it's gone. You're not, and those flood victims aren't paying you anything. So you're not really producing a revenue, but you're getting a benefit. The benefit in this case might be public goodwill. People are thinking, oh man, Walmart's not, everyone's seen that commercial where it's singing Joe Cocker's version of Little Help from My Friends from Walmart, because what they're doing is trying to say, hey, Walmart's awesome. They're donating food to hungry people. Well, they're not getting any money out of that. What they're doing is getting a lot of public goodwill. That's a benefit. That's a form of revenue. It's just not money. So keep in mind, when we talk about economics, money is often used as a measurement, but it's not the only measurement. There's other measurements out there, public benefit, employee retention, all these other, there are tons of other various ways that companies benefit from different actions other than just money. All right, so a cost is any expense associated with producing a product or running a business. Fixed costs, or we've gone over this if you've already had personal finance. A fixed cost is something that doesn't tend to change over time. Rent, taxes, that really pretty much stays the same based on percentages or by contract. Variable costs are things that change over time. So if you're working in something that uses commodities, I'll use the iron example. If the price of iron doubles tomorrow, the cost of anything I produce with iron will also go up. That's a variable cost. So it will cost me more to produce things with iron if the price of iron itself triples. All right. Right now, if you happen to be listening to this rather than just, copying down every single word that's being said while I'm muted and you're listening to music or something, the first person to come up to me and tell me a really corny joke that actually makes me laugh will get 5 points added onto a quiz grade. All right. Total cost equals this. Fixed costs plus variable costs, and the average total cost is the total cost divided by the quantity produced. Now, that's a very complicated way of saying if you have 1,000 swords that cost you $1,000 each to make, it means you have $1 million in cost to make the swords. If you have 1,000 swords that cost $1,000 each, that is the total the average total cost. You just divide the total cost by the quantity. So if I make 1,000 swords for $1 million, I divide that million by 1,000. Every sword has an average cost of $1,000. Now, marginal cost. This is where it gets a little hinky, guys, but don't freak out. It's the extra cost of producing one additional unit of output. And it can change depending on what's going on. But typically, every time you produce another copy of the same item, it will cost less each time. So think about what it would take to start from scratch and make a pizza. It would take a long time, right? You'd have to, when I say from scratch, I don't mean like you get the bread and dough. I mean, let's start at the farm, like water, land. Also, it would take a long, long time to make that one pizza. But if you were then to say, all right, if you were to take it from start to finish, that pizza would be like $100, right? Because you'd put so much time and effort into it because of like the farming, the land, and you do everything from start to finish, including cook and top and everything else. But what would let's say the total cost of that one pizza was $100? What if I told you then to go make two pizzas? Would those two pizzas each cost $100, or would it really be closer to be like, well, it was $100 for that first pizza, but really I've already done all the labor for everything else, so there's no additional cost there. That all I got in the second pizza is the cost of the dough and stuff, so it's $110. So I got that first pizza for $100 with all that effort I put into it, but the second one was only $10. That's the whole idea of building, buying, and selling in bulk. We want to mass produce things like the Model T. When you have US2, you'll talk about the Model T. And one of the reasons why they were able to get it so inexpensive was because the marginal cost kept going down and down and down as you made more and more and more of them, because you could buy things in bulk and cheapen the process. The first item that any factory makes is always the most expensive one because they had to build that whole factory to make that one first item. After that, it gets much, much cheaper. It never gets free, obviously, because raw goods cost money, employees cost money. But that first one's always the most expensive. After that, you're just making copies that you already have the ability to make. There's no extra cost adding on except for the cost of the raw goods and the human capital, like labor, to get it done. All right, revenue works in a very similar fashion. So it's the entire amount of income before any expenses are paid, including things like taxes. The total revenue is the number of units you sell multiplied by the average price per unit. So again, if your swords are being sold for $1,000 and you sell $1 million in swords, that means that each one of those swords costs $1,000. That's your total revenue. You multiply 1,000, the average price per unit, multiplied by 1,000 units sold. That would give you $1 million in sold swords. Now, marginal revenue is the change in the total revenue that results from selling one more unit of output. Now, typically, your revenue is going to be pretty stagnant if you sell the item for the same price the whole time. However, when it gets a little better when you start talking about taking out expenses, because the expense of making that first unit obviously is very high in theory. So you basically say, well, it cost me this much to make the first one, but the 1,000th one cost 1,000th less. It got cheaper as I made it. So basically, you're changing your total revenue every time you sell more of the output. All right, now we're going to talk about marginal benefits. And yes, I know every time I bring up the word marginal, it gets more complicated. All right, marginal benefit is the additional benefit of one more unit produced. Now, if we're talking about, let's go with, I used to use shoes as an example, but then that became kind of sexist. But let's go with shoes because I can't think of anything else right now. If you're selling women's shoes and you're selling them for $200 a piece, will a woman buy another 5 pairs of that same exact shoe? Probably not. Most people buy shoes differently. Like they buy red shoes, blue shoes. They're trying to match outfits, all that stuff. But for the most part, the benefit you get from a produced shoe, the first benefit's the biggest because people will actually get the most benefit out of that one more unit produced. But because marginal cost goes down as you produce more units, in theory, you get more benefit as you make more items. So let's say you sell. Let's go with swords instead of shoes now. Let's say you're able to sell 1,000 swords. Again, because of marginal cost, that first sword cost a whole lot of money. The average cost of your swords is 1,000. That first sword might have cost 10,000 because all the factory stuff you had to do to put it together. The next sword doesn't cost much at all, because you already got the factory. It's really just the iron, the metal to produce it, everything, and the labor. So that first sword, if you sold it for $1,000, you lost money because it might have cost tens of thousands of dollars to build that factory to make the sword. But after that, the marginal cost drops off significantly because the second item is always much cheaper to produce because all the infrastructure is there to make it. So you make that second sword, and then you sell that one for $1,000. You might make a profit off that one sword. And if you sell 1,000 more, you continue to make more and more marginal benefit. Because in theory, the more you produce, the lower and lower and lower your cost becomes, which means the profit margin goes up and up and up, as long as you sell at a consistent price. Now, there is a law of diminishing returns. At a certain point, each additional unit of input causes output to level off and eventually decline. Your marginal cost will outweigh your marginal benefit. So you'll slowly start getting less and less of a benefit until basically it levels off to... All right, so law of diminishing returns. So let's take the sword example. If you take a sword, the first one you make, because you got to build the factory and everything else, it's going to cost a very large amount. Let's say $10,000. Now the second sword you make is going to cost much less, and by the 1,000th sword you make, let's say it costs only $200 to make, so you're making $800 per sword that you sell it for $1,000. Now what happens at the 10,000th sword? Do you think it's gone down by that much percentage-wise? If you lost 80% of your cost, it's not going to go down another 80%. It's going to go down less and less and less each time. You're going to basically bottom out your marginal benefit. Now, you're still going to make a profit on those swords, but you're not going to keep increasing your profit the same way you did from sword 1 to sword 5, which would be like a big drop compared from sword 5 to sword 10, 10 to 20, 20, all the way down the line. It would look like an exponential decay graph, and I'll do it with the mouse real fast. So exponential growth would look like this. You go whoosh, and it would shoot up really fast. Decay works the other way. It starts high, shoots down low really fast, and then tapers off. And it's always going down a little lower each time, but it's less and less. And that's basically how diminishing returns works. You get less and less benefit out of doing the same exact action. All right, and cost-benefit analysis. All right, so this is what most companies, people, governments do anytime they have to make an economic choice. They compare the marginal cost with the marginal benefits of a decision. And basically, you should choose the action that has where the revenue is greater than the cost. So the greater has more benefits than costs or basic expenses or damages to whatever you're doing. That's typically the choice that's made. If the costs outweigh the benefits, you should reject that option. You should try to find some other option. You could use this model to determine those three basic questions: what, how, and for whom to produce.